As of this second, I no longer have a daughter named Amina. Beep, beep, beep. 32 seconds. That was the record time my biological father needed to convict, discard, and erase me from the family based entirely on a lie from my older sister. They didn't know or didn't care that the exact moment they roared at me, calling me a worthless piece of trash, I was on my knees on a freezing linoleum floor. One hand squeezing an IV bag, the other closing the eyes of my partner, who had just taken her last breath. And right as the heart monitor behind me stretched into an ear-piercing flatline, my phone lit up. A text from my sister. "I'm sorry, Amina. I had to tell Mom and Dad the truth." Accompanied by a broken heart emoji. 3 sentences and an icon. She had just dropped a bomb on my life and tied it with a neat little bow. My name is Amina, a major and head of surgery. They thought a knife in the back when I was at my most broken would kill me. They didn't know that 5 years later, the exact person who stabbed me would be lying in a pool of blood, barely breathing, waiting for me to hold the scalpel that decided her life. Let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever been thrown away by your own blood without a trial and had to grit your teeth to stand up and rebuild your life from a shattered heart. The phone slipped from my fingers. It hit the tile with a dull smack. I leaned my back against the drywall. The heart monitor attached to Sky's chest let out a single, unbroken scream. I stared at the glowing screen face up on the floor. Call ended. 0:00:32. My right hand gripped the edge of the metal medical cart. My knuckles turned bone white. The freezing temperature of the linoleum seeped straight through the heavy fabric of my pants, chilling the sweat on my skin. My knees started to shake. I pressed my boot heel hard into the floor, grinding the rubber down to stop the tremor. I had stayed awake for 3 straight days, flushing IV lines, listening to Sky's lungs fail. Meanwhile, my parents were sitting in their comfortable, climate-controlled living room back in Hartford, sipping tea, cursing my name. I had given Daisy my exact location, begging her to help me get a message through. She took that trust, spun it into a sick lie about me running away from my job, and served it to my father on a silver platter. Ding. The screen lit up again in the dark room. A harsh blue glare. Daisy's text. "I'm sorry, Amina. I had to tell Mom and Dad the truth." I read the words 3 times. My jaw locked. My teeth ground together so hard my ears rang. I didn't throw the device against the wall. I didn't scream. I reached down, pressed the power button, and held it. The screen went black. I placed the phone face down on the freezing tile. My breathing was jagged, short, ragged. I closed my eyes and forced the air through my nose. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale through the mouth for 4. I repeated the cycle 12 times. The mechanical rhythm worked. My heart rate dropped. The tears burning the back of my throat were forced down, swallowed like cheap medicine. I opened my eyes. The softness was entirely gone. I stood up and walked over to the bed. I reached for the plastic clips on Sky's chest and snapped them off. The screeching flatline stopped. Silence flooded the room, heavy and suffocating. I pulled the needle from her bruised vein. I grabbed the edge of the thin hospital blanket and pulled it up, covering my friend's face. On the edge of the bedside lamp, a small faded yellow sticky note caught the light. I peeled it off. I folded it precisely in half, then in half, again creating a perfect tight square. I slipped it into my chest pocket. My fingertips scraped against a stiff piece of fabric resting at the very bottom. An old silver ribbon, frayed at the edges. Instantly, the sterile chemical stench of the rubbing alcohol faded from the room. The ghost of a different smell hit the back of my throat. The harsh, burnt stench of cheap black coffee. 8th grade. The smell of burnt, bitter coffee hung heavy in the kitchen air. I stood by the scratched oak dining table, the wood still sticky from breakfast, smoothing out a silver ribbon with my thumbs. 2nd place in the state science fair. I carefully set it down next to my father's ceramic mug. Marley didn't even flinch. He stayed hidden behind the morning newspaper. The dry, raspy sound of the pages turning was the only response I got. He took a long drag of his black coffee, cleared his throat, and muttered, "Good job." His eyes never dropped to look at it. Across the table, my older sister Daisy lifted her glass of ice water. She took a slow sip, hiding a sharp, knowing smirk behind the rim. That weekend, the air in the high school auditorium was stifling and smelled like stale sweat. Marley and my mother Leslie sat dead center in the front row. The camera shutter clicked endlessly as my mother leaned forward, capturing every single second. When the curtain fell, my father stood up abruptly. He clapped so hard his thick, calloused palms turned bright red. Daisy stood center stage, clutching a massive bouquet of 24 long-stemmed red roses. She was worshipped, all for reciting lines someone else had written. When we returned to the house, I walked into the kitchen. My silver ribbon was exactly where I left it on the granite counter. Only now it had been shoved near the toaster, gathering a thin layer of grease and dust. Nobody had moved it to a frame. Nobody had pinned it to the fridge. I didn't throw a tantrum. I picked the ribbon up and dropped it straight into the metal trash can. It landed on wet coffee grounds and crushed eggshells. Right then, I figured out the brutal math of the Hughes household. I was a utility bill, a basic maintenance cost to keep the lights on. Daisy was the investment. I stopped looking for warmth and replaced it with iron. I started waking up at 5 in the morning. I ran 3 miles in the freezing, pitch-black cold while the rest of the house snored. I spent my weekends locked in the drafty, oil-stained garage. The cold concrete floor numbed my feet through my thin socks while I dissected frogs on a rusted folding table. I spent hours memorizing the exact density of human bone mass, tracing anatomy charts with absolute precision. Up in her bedroom, Daisy blasted pop music and practiced crying on cue in her vanity mirror. I didn't care anymore. I kept my spine completely straight. I folded my clothes into rigid, perfect squares. I turned myself into a machine they couldn't break. Fast forward to senior year. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and sour milk. I walked in and tossed a thick, heavy envelope onto the granite island. The official seal of a full-ride medical college acceptance. It hit the stone with a solid, undeniable thud. The rustling newspaper stopped. Marley slowly lowered the sports section. He stared at the thick envelope, then looked up at me. For the very first time in 18 years, there was a heavy, quiet respect in his eyes. Leslie snatched the kitchen landline off the wall and immediately started dialing the neighbors to brag. The invisible girl suddenly had value. Before I tell you what Daisy did next, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment below. Tell me the exact moment you realized your family played favorites. What was your silver ribbon in the trash? I read every single one. I looked across the island at my sister. Her lips were stretched into a wide, picture-perfect smile, but her eyes were dead. They were cold, flat, and entirely hollow. She didn't offer a single word of congratulations. She just stared at me, holding her metal fork. Clack. She drove the fork down hard against her ceramic plate, a sharp, jarring sound that cut right through my mother's loud, breathless bragging on the phone. Daisy pushed her wooden chair back. The legs scraped violently against the floorboards, leaving a visible scratch, and she walked away down the dark hallway. I sat on the cold floor of Sky's empty living room. 5 days had passed. 14 phone calls. I punched the familiar Hartford area code into my phone. The landline rang twice. Click. My father picked up. He didn't say a single word. He just slammed the heavy plastic receiver back down onto the cradle. I dialed again. This time, a harsh, rapid beep, beep, beep drilled into my ear. A blocked line. The busy signal felt like a physical slap across the face. I opened my laptop. The screen cast a cold blue glare over the dark, quiet room. I attached an official government PDF, my approved medical dispatch document bearing a thick red administrative seal. Concrete proof that Daisy was lying. Proof I hadn't abandoned my job or run away. I hit send on the email. Silence. No reply. Just the low buzzing hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My eyes burned from pure exhaustion. My hands still smelled like harsh, antibacterial soap. I was a doctor keeping people breathing, but to my parents, I was just trash waiting to be taken out to the curb. I needed a physical bridge. I called Aunt Jackie. I asked her to drive over to the house. I waited 40 minutes. My phone buzzed. I answered. Before she even spoke, I heard the heavy metallic clatter of her car keys being thrown onto a wooden table. A deep, exhausted sigh followed. He wouldn't even let me in, Amina. Aunt Jackie said, her voice shaking with disbelief. I stood on the porch. Your father opened the door exactly 2 inches. He said you were a disgrace to the uniform. He told me to get off his property. Did you tell him about the document? I asked. My voice was completely flat, empty. He slammed the door in my face before I could finish the sentence. The line went dead. I could coordinate emergency medical evacuations in the absolute worst conditions imaginable, but I couldn't get past a front door in suburban Connecticut. The house I grew up in was now a fortress, and I was permanently locked out. On the 6th day, I sat at the kitchen counter and took out a black pen. I wrote 4 pages. I wrote down the exact timeline. I explained the medical emergency, the lack of sleep, the exact words my sister had twisted. My handwriting was sharp, pressing hard into the paper. I shoved the pages into a thick envelope, licked the seal, and pressed a USPS stamp into the corner. I dropped it in the outgoing mail. A week later, I unlocked my small metal mailbox. The rusted hinges squeaked. There it was. My own handwriting stared back at me. But right across the center, smeared in thick, wet-looking red ink, was a heavy rubber stamp. Returned to sender. Unopened. I stood in the freezing wind, running my thumb over the edge of the flap. It was perfectly smooth, completely sealed. The paper hadn't even been bent. They didn't read a single word. They didn't want the truth. The truth was an inconvenience. The lie protected the golden child. The truth would have forced my father to look in the mirror and admit he was wrong. Marley Hughes would rather erase his own daughter from existence than bruise his fragile ego. 2 days later, I sat in the front row of an empty memorial hall. I wore my formal dress uniform. The dark fabric was stiff, heavily pressed. The brass buttons caught the dim overhead light. The air smelled like old wood and dusty carpets. I stared straight ahead. I didn't cry. My tear ducts felt like they had been burned shut. When I got back to my room, I started packing. I didn't leave a single trace of myself behind. I folded my shirts into tight, aggressive, precise squares. I lined up my boots' toes perfectly even. I wiped down the desk until the cheap laminate squeaked. The room was sterile. I picked up the small, faded yellow sticky note Sky had left on the lamp. I read her slanted handwriting one last time. Finish the job. Don't let bloodline dictate your worth. I folded the yellow paper in half. I placed it into the breast pocket of my jacket right over my heart. I grabbed the thick brown flaps of the cardboard moving box. I folded them over, left, right, top, bottom. I pulled the heavy plastic packing tape dispenser. I dragged it across the cardboard seam. The tape ripped off the roll with a loud, violent screech. I buried myself in the machine. I worked until my body went numb. I ate cold leftover pasta standing over a stainless steel kitchen sink, swallowing fast just to get the calories in. I stood in operating rooms until the muscles in my right hand cramped into a rigid claw. I would have to take my left hand and physically bend my fingers straight again one by one, feeling the joints pop. I earned my promotion. I secured the top surgical residency spot at Vanguard Medical Center. The night I got the acceptance letter, I sat in my dark apartment rolling Sky's folded yellow sticky note between my thumb and index finger. The next morning, Laura Gallagher walked into my operating room. She was the chief of surgery. Short, iron gray hair. She didn't say a single word. She just stood by the stainless steel double doors, her eyes tracking my hands as I stitched a complex laceration. When I tied the final knot, she gave one sharp, deliberate nod. Chief Gallagher became the mother I'd lost. She didn't offer warm hugs. She offered correction. She straightened my posture when my shoulders slumped. She waited for me outside the scrub room after a 16-hour shift, handing me a foil-wrapped breakfast sandwich. Her hands were rough, calloused from decades of holding a scalpel. They were the most comforting hands I had ever known. 6 months later, I met Luke Matthews in the hospital cafeteria. He was a government attorney specifically handling internal legal affairs. He was calm, quiet. He pointed at the medical journal I was reading and asked a single intelligent question. Half a year after that cafeteria meeting, I sat on his faded leather sofa. I talked for 45 straight minutes. I laid out the entire timeline of my family. The science fair ribbon, The phone calls, the red stamp, the lies. I didn't cry. My voice was completely flat. Luke didn't pity me. He didn't offer a dramatic gasp. He just looked at me with the quiet, calculating stillness of a man who spent his life analyzing facts and evidence. "You deserved better," he said. No emotion. Just a statement of absolute, undeniable fact. 2 years later, 30 folding chairs were set up in a small, sterile chapel. Luke's father, a retired senior official, stood next to me at the back of the aisle. He had known me for 24 months. The man who shared my DNA had known me for 25 years. But it was Mr. Matthews who offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his elbow. He patted my wrist. It was warm, solid. 3 days before I walked down that aisle, I'd opened my mailbox. A thick, cream-colored envelope sat inside. I recognized the stamp I'd placed on it weeks ago. I had sent a wedding invitation to the Hartford house, a final silent offering of peace. Across the front, the same wet red ink. Return to sender. Unopened. I didn't keep it this time. I walked straight to the small office shredder under Luke's desk. I didn't even open the envelope. I shoved it directly into the metal teeth. The machine whined and ground the thick paper into thin, useless white strips. I stood there watching the pieces fall into the clear plastic bin, piling up like snow. I felt nothing but a quiet, hollow relief. I was free. I married Luke. We built a quiet, disciplined life. The house was clean. The noise was gone. Until a Tuesday evening in November. I walked into the kitchen, dropping my keys on the counter. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room. But Luke wasn't cooking. He was standing completely still by the granite island. A thick, heavy manila folder rested on the counter in front of him. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just kept his eyes locked on the paper inside. "Amina." His voice was dangerously low, stripped of all warmth. "We need to talk about your sister." Luke set his coffee mug down on the kitchen island. A heavy, hollow thud. He slid a thick yellow manila folder across the granite. The paper made a dry, scratching sound against the stone. "I was running a routine audit on internal legal inquiries," Luke said. His voice was completely flat. "Someone called the Government Administrative Board 2 years ago, an anonymous tip line." I picked up the folder. I opened it. "They were trying to find out if you had been stripped of your rank, if you had any severe disciplinary records or malpractice suits on file," he continued. He reached over and tapped the tip of his metal pen against a single line of printed data. The click of the metal hitting the paper echoed in the quiet kitchen. An IP address. The geographic location of the anonymous caller. A suburb in Hartford, Connecticut. I stared at the numbers. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't feel the familiar sting of betrayal in my chest. I only felt a sudden, absolute, freezing clarity. The house I grew up in. My older sister wasn't just crying to our parents to get attention. She was actively trying to destroy my career. She was trying to turn her own sick lie into a reality by weaponizing the legal system against me. I closed the folder. The cardboard snapped shut. I picked up my phone and called Aunt Jackie. She answered on the third ring. I didn't say hello. I just asked her what happened at the house last Thanksgiving. Aunt Jackie let out a long, heavy sigh. The exhaustion in her voice was thick. She told me the whole story. Daisy had sat at the head of the dining table carving the turkey. She dabbed her eyes with a cloth napkin and told all 47 members of the extended family that I had been disgracefully fired. She told them I was currently living in a homeless shelter somewhere on the West Coast, married to a convicted felon. They all believed her, Amina, Aunt Jackie whispered. She was crying so hard she threw up in the downstairs bathroom. Your mother had to hold her hair back. I hung up the phone. I stood in my expensive kitchen wearing my hospital scrubs, realizing my entire extended family pictured me digging through dumpsters. Daisy had built an entire alternative reality. She fed it to my parents, and they ate every single bite. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a glass against the wall. I walked into the home office. I opened the heavy steel door of our fireproof safe. I placed the yellow folder inside right next to our passports and marriage certificate. I spun the metal dial. It locked with a heavy, satisfying click. Daisy wanted to play God with my life. She wanted to erase me. I was going to let her keep thinking she had won. Right up until the moment I dropped the sky on her head. Before we get to the hospital, hit the like button and subscribe. Leave a comment right now. Tell me about a time a family member spread a completely insane rumor about you just to make themselves look like the victim. What was the wildest lie they told? I want to read them. I closed the safe. I walked back into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. Before my hand even touched the faucet, my emergency medical pager went off. It wasn't a standard beep. It was the harsh vibrating screech of a code red trauma alert. The plastic box clipped to my waist shook violently. A bright red LED light flashed against the kitchen cabinets. I grabbed my medical tablet from the counter. The screen lit up, casting a pale blue glow over my face. ETA, 8 minutes. Severe blunt force trauma to the abdomen. I scrolled down to the patient manifest. My thumb froze over the glass screen. The air in my lungs stopped moving. Patient name, Daisy Hughes. Emergency contact, Marley Hughes. I stared at the name. The woman who tried to ruin my life was currently bleeding out in the back of an ambulance speeding directly toward my operating room. The ER hallway was blinding. Harsh fluorescent light bounced off the polished floor, making my eyes ache. Every chaotic sound, the shouting paramedics, the squeaking stretcher wheels, faded into a dull, rushing hum. I locked my jaw so tight my teeth ground together. I walked straight to the stainless steel scrub sink outside operating room 2. The motion sensor clicked. Scalding hot water rushed over my hands and wrists, turning my skin bright red. I grabbed the stiff bristle brush and scrubbed the harsh antibacterial soap under my fingernails until my cuticles stung. I stared down at the swirling water in the metal drain. I took a sharp breath, forcing the memory of that 32-second phone call to the very back of my brain. I buried the fake broken heart emoji under layers of cold, heavy concrete. I shut the human part of me off completely. I backed through the heavy swinging doors into the OR. The room smelled intensely of rubbing alcohol, metallic blood, and iodine. The patient was already prepped, completely hidden beneath sterile blue surgical drapes. Only a small bruised section of her abdomen was exposed under the glaring overhead lights. The heart monitor beeped with a frantic, uneven rhythm. I stepped up to the table. Attending Surgeon Ramirez stood across from me, her dark eyes scanning the monitors. I looked straight at her. My voice cut cleanly through the mechanical hiss of the ventilator. The patient on this table is my sister. Ramirez froze. Her hands stopped moving over the tray. If my hands shake for even a fraction of a second, you step in and take over. I said, my tone completely flat. Understood. Ramirez swallowed hard, giving one sharp nod. I held out my right hand. A heavy steel scalpel was slapped into my palm. The metal felt ice cold through my gloves. I looked down at the exposed skin. The golden child. The perfect investment. The woman who wanted my entire extended family to believe I was a homeless criminal. She was completely broken, bleeding out internally on a cold table. Her life depended entirely on the exact hands our father had treated like an absolute waste of space. It was the ultimate bitter irony. I made the first incision. 3 hours and 40 minutes. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I moved with the cold mechanical exactness of a factory machine. Clamp, cut, suction, suture. The sounds in the room were purely physical and brutal. The wet tearing of damaged tissue. The heavy clatter of metal instruments tossed into stainless steel bowls. The rhythmic dragging wheeze of the breathing machine forcing oxygen into Daisy's lungs. I clamped a ruptured artery deep in her abdomen. I removed the shattered, bleeding pieces of her spleen. I stitched a jagged tear in her liver. Every single movement was violently precise. I didn't let a single ounce of anger guide the blade, and I didn't let a drop of pity soften the needle. I just did the work. Ramirez watched me like a hawk, but she didn't have to reach across the table a single time. I owned the room. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, I pulled the heavy synthetic thread through the final layer of skin. I tied the knot. I pulled it tight. The frantic, chaotic beeping of the monitor had finally settled into a slow, steady, boring rhythm. Daisy was going to live. I stepped back from the metal table. My shoulders were stiff as boards. The back of my neck throbbed from looking down for nearly 4 hours. "Good work, Dr. Hughes," Ramirez said, exhaling heavily behind her paper mask. She rolled her stiff shoulders. "I can go out to the waiting room. I'll update your parents." I grabbed the wrists of my blood-soaked latex gloves. I snapped them off, pulling them inside out. I threw them into the red biohazard bin. They hit the plastic lining with a wet, heavy slap. "No," I said aggressively, untying the strings of my surgical gown. "I'll handle the family." The heavy metal door of the family waiting room whined on its hinges as I pushed it open. Marley and Leslie were huddled together on cheap, hard plastic chairs. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow over them. They looked gray, old, shrunken. The parents who had screamed at me, the people who had proudly told our entire family I was a homeless failure, were now shaking in a sterile hospital waiting area, staring at the floor. They heard my boots against the linoleum and looked up. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the metal zipper of my blood-stained surgical fleece. I yanked it down violently. The loud, jagged sound of the zipper ripping open made them both flinch. I pulled the heavy fleece off my shoulders and threw it over the back of an empty chair. Underneath, I wore my crisp, perfectly pressed navy blue hospital scrubs. Heavy, expensive fabric. Over my left chest pocket, crisp gold stitching caught the harsh overhead light. It spelled out my reality in bold block letters: Amina Laura Hughes, Chief of Surgery. Marley stood up so fast his chair screeched backward. "Listen here, miss." He started using that deep, demanding voice he always used to control the room. Then he stopped. His jaw locked open. His eyes dropped to the gold stitching on my chest. He read the letters. His face went entirely blank. He stared at the name. Then his eyes slowly crawled up my chest, past my neck, stopping dead on my face. The shock hit him physically like a sledgehammer directly to his ribs. He swayed on his feet, reaching out a hand to steady himself against the wall. The homeless disgrace he had thrown away was the absolute authority in this building. Leslie let out a loud, pathetic sob and rushed forward, throwing her arms out to hug me. I took one sharp, calculated step backward. The distance was a physical wall. I did not want her touch. I didn't want her tears. "I am Chief Surgeon Hughes," I said. My voice was colder than the tile floor. "Your daughter is out of surgery. She will live." Marley tried to recover. He tried to rebuild his shattered ego right there in the waiting room. His face flushed bright red. "Amina, do not talk to your mother like that. This is not the time to be a..." I just spent 3 hours and 40 minutes inside a trauma room keeping her heart beating. I cut him off. My voice didn't raise a single decibel, but it sliced through his authority like a blade. "I know exactly what time it is, and I know exactly what condition she is in, better than anyone else in this state." Marley's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. The great patriarch of the Hughes family, the man who demanded absolute respect at the dinner table, folded like a cheap lawn chair. He sank back down onto the plastic seat, rubbing his trembling hands over his face. The heavy door swung open again. Medical Director Laura Gallagher walked into the waiting room. Her presence immediately shifted the air pressure. She ignored my parents completely. She walked straight to me. "Chief Hughes." Director Gallagher said, her voice echoing off the bare walls. "Exceptional work in OR2. The medical board just formally approved your nomination. You are the surgical director of the year." I looked at her. I gave a single firm nod of professional respect. "Thank you, Director." Marley let out a ragged gasp. He was staring at me like he was looking at a ghost. Leslie slid off her plastic chair, kneeling on the cold floor, crying loudly into her hands, muttering apologies I didn't care to hear. I didn't offer a tissue. I didn't offer a hug. I turned my back on them and walked out of the room. My boots hit the floor in a steady, ruthless rhythm. Tomorrow morning, when the anesthesia wore off, the intensive care unit was going to turn into a courtroom. The intensive care unit was freezing. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of the ventilator cut through the silence. I stood at the foot of the bed, my arms crossed, watching the anesthesia slowly wear off. Daisy's eyelids fluttered. She groaned a dry, raspy sound like gravel rubbing together. Her eyes opened. They were glazed, confused, until they focused on the foot of the bed. They locked onto my face. Then they dropped to the thick gold stitching on my scrubs. Her pupils shrank. The color drained from her face, turning her skin the exact same shade of pale gray as the hospital sheets. The sister she had buried alive 5 years ago was standing over her, holding the absolute highest medical authority in the building. "Amina," she croaked. Her voice was weak, shaking. "Listen, I can explain." I didn't answer. I reached behind me and pushed the heavy glass door open. Marley and Leslie walked into the ICU. They looked exhausted, their shoulders stooped. The second Daisy saw her parents' muscle memory kicked in, she reached for her oldest, most reliable weapon. Tears. Her eyes welled up. She let out a pathetic, shaking sob. She reached a trembling hand toward our mother, her voice dripping with fake terror. "Mom, Dad, I was so confused," she cried, squeezing her eyes shut. "I didn't know what was happening. Amina never called me." In the past, that performance would have bought her anything. It would have bought her 24 red roses. But the power dynamic in the room had violently shifted. Marley's face didn't soften. It turned dark red. The veins in his neck bulged. He stepped toward the bed and roared. "She is the chief of surgery." The sheer volume of his voice made the heart monitor jump. Daisy flinched, shrinking back into the mattress. Marley pointed a thick, shaking finger at me. "She spent 4 hours putting you back together, and you're still lying to my face." I pulled a heavy hospital-issued iPad from the pocket of my white coat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I stepped up to the side of the bed and tapped the glass screen. I shoved it directly into my father's line of sight. "Exhibit A," I said, my voice ice cold. The official medical dispatch log from 5 years ago, approved and signed by the state board, proving I was working. I swiped the screen. Exhibit B, my formal board promotion certificate from 2 years ago. I swiped one last time, tapping a highlighted block of text. Exhibit C, the IP address logged from an anonymous phone call made to the State Medical Review Board attempting to get my medical license permanently revoked. I stared dead into Marley's eyes. "The call came from your living room in Hartford. This entire smear campaign was directed by your golden child." Leslie's knees gave out. She collapsed against the wall, clutching the fabric of her shirt over her chest, letting out a loud, wailing sob. Marley turned away. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the ICU window. His heavy shoulders started to shake. For the first time in 60 years, Marley Hughes was crying. The great patriarch realized he was nothing but a pawn. He had thrown away his only successful child to protect a liar. If you've ever had to use cold, hard facts to expose a toxic family member's lies, hit the like button and subscribe. Leave a comment below with just the word receipts if you know the exact feeling of finally proving you were right all along. Marley slowly turned around. His eyes were bloodshot. His Adam's apple bobbed hard as he swallowed his pride. He took a step toward me, his voice breaking. "Amina, I am so sorry. Please." I raised my right hand, a sharp, flat palm facing him. A physical stop sign. Marley froze. "I believe you regret it," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "But if you ever want to step foot into my territory again, you will follow my rules." Marley stared at my raised hand. He swallowed hard, lowering his chin, and gave a single defeated nod. 2 weeks later, we sat in a neutral coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital district. The smell of roasted espresso beans hung in the air. Daisy looked awful. She was hunched over the small wooden table, clutching her cheap designer handbag against her chest like a physical shield. The surgical staples in her abdomen forced her to sit rigidly, but she was still trembling. Her hands shook so badly that her silver wedding ring kept tapping a sharp, nervous rhythm against the wood. Clack, clack, clack. I sat perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked at her. I asked one single word. "Why?" The polished golden child facade completely shattered. Daisy gripped the edge of the table. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "Because you were going to become everything I couldn't. I was stuck in Hartford working retail and you were leaving. I couldn't stand it." She confessed to the entire smear campaign, every lie, every exaggerated tear at the Thanksgiving table. I didn't react. I reached into my coat pocket and slid a yellow legal pad across the table. It stopped right in front of her. "The medical board doesn't protect me, Daisy," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "They protect the truth, and now so will you." I laid out the terms. She had 48 hours to draft a mass email. She would send it to all 47 members of the Hughes extended family. She would list every single lie she had told about me, and she would formally retract them in her own words. "You will correct the record," I stated. It wasn't a request. "That is non-negotiable." Daisy stared at the blank yellow paper. She slowly lowered her head, hiding her face, and gave a small jerky nod. The next morning, I summoned Marley and Leslie to my administrative office at the hospital. They sat on the other side of my heavy steel desk. Marley looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the sterile, organized room, taking in the framed medical degrees on the wall. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a crisp white business card. I tossed it onto the metal surface. It slid across and stopped right in front of him. Marley picked it up, squinting at the text. "Dr. Eris Thorne, licensed family therapist." "Therapy, twice a week," I ordered. Marley's thick eyebrows crashed together, his jaw set. The stubborn patriarch instinctively prepared to fight back. He opened his mouth to refuse to tell me he didn't need some stranger shrinking his head. I stood up. I planted both of my palms flat on the steel desk, leaning forward. My shadow fell over him. The physical pressure of the movement forced him to lean back into his chair. "That right there is exactly why we are sitting in this room, sir," I said. My voice was low, heavy, and absolutely unyielding. The word "sir" hit him like a physical blow to the mouth. It stripped away all familial warmth. It wasn't a daughter speaking to a father. It was an authority figure addressing a subordinate. Marley Hughes realized in that exact second that he had zero leverage left. He was completely under my control. He let out a long, heavy, defeated sigh. He opened his worn leather wallet, slid the white business card inside, and stood up. He walked out of my office without saying a word, pulling his wife along behind him. The following afternoon, my phone pinged. An email notification. Daisy had sent the confession. I opened my social media apps. I watched my friends list. One by one, the little green active dots next to Daisy's name across all platforms began to disappear. The extended family was reading her email. The silent, brutal execution of the Hughes family cancel culture was happening in real time. Within an hour, every single green dot was gone. She was completely isolated in the dark. 1 month later. The annual medical board gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, heavy light over the crowded banquet hall. Silverware clinked softly against china. Medical Director Gallagher stood in front of me on the polished wooden stage. She held a brushed silver medal. She pinned it just above the gold stitching of my title. The medal felt freezing against my chest, but the physical weight of it was grounding. Luke sat at the front table watching me, a quiet smile on his face. In the very last row near the swinging kitchen doors, my parents sat in the shadows. They looked small, shrunken and out of place in their old formal clothes. I stepped up to the microphone. The room went completely quiet. "Family isn't always blood," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the speakers. "Sometimes family is the colleagues who pull you out of the longest, darkest shifts, the people who choose to stay when things break. But sometimes," I looked straight to the back of the room, "the people who share your DNA finally find their way to the right side of the room. They are here tonight." Leslie pressed a crumpled tissue to her face, her shoulders shaking. After the applause faded, Marley walked straight up to Luke near the coat check. The smell of damp wool hung in the air. Marley didn't puff out his chest. He stood rigidly, his spine stiff like a reprimanded employee reporting to a manager. "I owe you an apology, son," Marley said. His voice was rough, scraping against his throat. "The man walking her down that aisle, it should have been me. I failed her. I failed you both." Luke didn't smile. He didn't offer a warm, forgiving handshake to smooth the tension over. He just gave a slow, respectful nod. He let the uncomfortable silence hang there. The heavy, suffocating patriarchy of the Hughes family died right there on that carpeted floor. Present day, Sunday morning. Soft white snow fell silently outside the front window of our new house. The doorbell rang. Just once. I walked to the entryway and looked through the frosted glass. Marley and Leslie stood on the freezing porch. The wind whipped around their heavy coats. Marley held a plastic jug of orange juice. Leslie clutched a tin box of bakery cookies. 5 years ago, my father would have aggressively turned the knob, walked right in, and demanded a fresh pot of coffee. Today they stood frozen on the welcome mat, waiting for an order. I unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy wooden door swung open. I looked at them for 3 long seconds. I let the freezing air rush into the warm foyer. Then I took one deliberate step back, opening my territory to them. "Come in," I said. Marley stepped inside. He immediately kicked off his heavy boots, walking in thick wool socks across my hardwood floor. He walked into the kitchen, asking in a quiet, hesitant voice if he could set the table. I watched him from the granite counter. The man who used to slam his coffee mug down and completely ignore my silver ribbon was now placing ceramic plates onto placemats with absolute terrifying caution. He moved like he was handling broken glass. Terrified of making the wrong sound, terrified of losing me again. Leslie walked up behind me. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders. She rested her forehead against the back of my shoulder blade, pressing into the exact spot over my heart where Sky's yellow sticky note used to sit. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, but it wasn't toxic anymore. It was the quiet, desperate work of people learning how to pay their debts. I stood tall in my own house. I owned my title. I owned my space. And under the strict, unbreakable boundaries I had built from the ground up, I finally allowed myself to be a daughter again. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found strength in this journey, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the peace and healing you deserve. Goodbye.